Local programming on KRWG Public Media made possible in part by viewers like you. Thank you.
This is KRWG Public Media, TV, radio, online, news that matters. Now, across the Mesilla Valley and the borderland, the stories that shape our community. From the KRWG Broadcast Center at New Mexico State University, this is Newsmakers.
Welcome to Newsmakers. I'm Jonny Coker. In collaboration with the Carlsbad Current Argus, KRWG is investigating solutions to the rise of earthquakes in the Permian Basin and how policymakers and researchers can work together in order to ease the seismic activity at the Texas-New Mexico border. I have more in this report. The Permian Basin has seen an increase in seismic activity tied to produced water injections by the oil and gas industry, but it is not the first place to encounter this issue. According to the USGS, a surge of earthquakes in Oklahoma started in 2009, with 90 magnitude 2 or larger earthquakes reported in the 9 years before, and over 10,000 reported between 2010 and 2019. Jake Walter is a state seismologist at the Oklahoma Geological Survey. Walter said that the solutions to seismicity revolved around prioritizing the gathering and sharing of data, and that when the Oklahoma Corporation Commission stepped in to enforce regulations in the state, the severity of the quakes diminished.
High-rate disposal wells were more likely than not to produce seismicity. So they put caps on certain individual permits, and they also examined different areas where there was, flurries of seismic activity. But also, when there were larger earthquakes, they required those disposal operators to pause operations entirely. And so we studied that effect, whether that was effective or not. And we actually found that, in some cases, after any kind of earthquake, there's an expectation of aftershocks, right? And so we showed that actually those regulatory measures to pause operations after large earthquakes were actually effective because it mitigated some amount of seismic activity in the aftershock period.
But some officials in New Mexico are not concerned with the increase in seismic activity. John Waters is the executive director of the Carlsbad Department of Development. He said that while he can feel the quakes, he's not worried about them as the epicenter of most quakes are in Texas.
It's not happening here. And so, is it a major issue? Are people being hurt? Is the environment being hurt? Not that we can tell. I haven't seen any data to that effect. So it's a curiosity right now. I don't even think it's an annoyance. I mean, even for the people that live there, most people don't barely even feel that.
Waters said that the increase in oil and gas production is an opportunity for New Mexicans, not a threat. But for Mike Hightower, program director at the New Mexico Produced Water Research Consortium at New Mexico State University, the earthquakes in Texas pose a threat to the industry in New Mexico due to the fact that New Mexico sends a significant portion of its produced water to be injected into Texas wells.
If there continues to be seismic activity in Texas and they limit that, it's going to be limiting some of the water that's coming from New Mexico going to Texas. And so that is going to have an impact on production in New Mexico. It's going to have an impact on jobs in New Mexico.
But with emerging treatment technology, Hightower said that he believes produced water could be used to supplement New Mexican industries, bringing environmental, ecological, and economic benefits.
What everybody wants to pick on oil and gas because of greenhouse gas emissions, but if you want to go to a hydrogen economy, you've got to have water. We don't have the water to support a hydrogen economy. With produced water, we can support a hydrogen economy. So we can actually, with produced water, we can reduce our greenhouse gas emissions a lot.
According to a report from the New Mexico Legislative Finance Committee, matched taxable gross receipts from mining, quarrying, and oil and gas are estimated to hit over $2.8 billion in fiscal year 2023, over $1.3 billion compared to 2022. This has led to record-breaking income for the state. And New Mexico isn't the only state seeing profits from the Permian Basin boom. Teresa Winkles is the mayor of Pecos, Texas, a small community in the Permian Basin. She said that the earthquakes are something she's never experienced in the area until recently, but is ultimately not concerned.
I thought somebody literally had hit the building. It was like it shook the whole building, and then it just felt like it was a roll. It was a wave that kind of went under the building. If they were earthquakes like we've seen in California and buildings, shake and all that, But these, I mean, like, they don't come very often. I know people are pushing the Railroad Commission to keep monitoring all of this, so.
The Texas Railroad Commission has implemented many of the same safeguards as Oklahoma to prevent seismic activity caused by produced water injections. And in New Mexico, the Oil Conservation Division has its own seismicity response protocol. But to Jake Walter, an increase in volume is a significant cause for concern and should be monitored and regulated carefully.
More frequent activity is a suggestion that the earthquake hazard is higher in an area. And since we can't know what that ultimate magnitude is going to be, that highest expected magnitude, then there should be some concern about the public safety.
Walter said that there must be a balance struck between ethical gas extraction and keeping surrounding communities safe. You can find more reporting on Permian Basin seismicity at krwg.org/shaky-ground. Joining us now to talk more in depth about the oil and gas industry in New Mexico is District 35 State Representative Angelica Rubio. Representative Rubio, thanks so much for being here with us.
Absolutely. Thank you, Johnny.
So let's just jump right into it. What do you believe is the biggest obstacle facing the oil and gas industry right now, the biggest challenge?
The biggest challenge for the oil and gas industry right now is really the institution, the industry itself, really looking into the future about how they're going to support families, frontline communities particularly, who are living and working in their industry to provide a sustainable economy for those local communities. Right now, I think that's one of the biggest issues that the state is facing in terms of its revenues. And I believe that the oil and gas industry has a responsibility to play in all of that. And part of that is to provide opportunities for communities in that area, but also to be able to also give a sustainable economy to those localities who have been making the industry so wealthy over the course of the last few decades.
Okay, and with that in mind, as a policymaker, as a lawmaker, how do you strike a balance between, the oil and gas industry being such an economic driver and also environmental concerns? How do you weigh those things?
I was born in the Permian Basin. I grew up there. A lot of my family still resides in that area. And a lot of the way that my philosophy is that we will attain climate goals if we prioritize frontline communities. And so for me, when we're talking about building a restorative economy here in New Mexico, one that is sustainable, one that will provide for our state, both from a financial point of view, but also from a public health and from a climate perspective, I believe that we should be focusing on what the frontline communities need first. And what I hear time and time again is that they do want jobs that are healthy, that will provide for their families long term. And that isn't something that the oil and gas industry will be able to continue to do for very long. And so the state, with leadership, policymakers, and my colleagues in the legislature, those are the things that we've been working on over the course of the last few years, is to try to design what that looks like, whether it be through solar, wind. I know cannabis has been very influential in our revenues lately, as well as the outdoor economy, which is something that I've helped to build through policy over the course of the last few years.
I wanted to ask about the connection between the oil and gas industry and these earthquakes in the Permian Basin. What specifically do you think needs to be done from a policy perspective in order to address these environmental concerns?
Right now, I think what's happening is, and it has been happening for the last few years, especially during the 7 years that I've been serving in the legislature, is that there has been a lack of courage from policymakers to be able to really be bold about confronting the realities of what oil and gas industries have done to the state. I think that from a jobs perspective, we have to look at the big picture, that a lot of the jobs that exist in these communities will not necessarily last for a very long time. But when we're talking about what it's doing to the land specifically, it's very problematic. I know that there are policies that have been introduced over the course of the last few years around fracking, doing a complete ban on fracking, but they haven't centered the communities that these industries need, and then vice versa. Communities also need these industries to survive for their own livelihood. So I think that there have been policies that have been promoted in the past to address some of these issues around what fracking and other types of oil and gas industry extractive type of tools are being utilized. But I think that the reason that they haven't been able to be successfully passed is because they haven't been centering communities, and I think that's important as we move forward, especially when we're still experiencing so much of these issues.
So, Representative, how do you work with regulatory entities and industry leaders in order to help find that balance that we were talking with earlier, and maybe even environmentalists? How do you work with those people in order to create policies that would help those communities?
I think it's important to elevate the voices of the folks that are being directly impacted. There's several organizations throughout the state who work directly with frontline communities that elevating their voices when we're talking to governmental officials as well as to environmental communities, to be able to have them share their lived experiences around what it's like to live in places like Hobbs and Carlsbad and Jal and Eunice. All of these small communities are all very much, their survival is dependent on this industry, and they also care about their public health. They also care about their surroundings. And so if we're able, the work that I've been able to do as a legislator is to be able to build relationships with communities who live in these areas so that they can then speak on behalf of their own community to be able to share their own experiences. I think that from that perspective, that's very important, especially when a policymaker can hear stories that are of people who are being impacted directly.
Okay, so how do you envision the future of the state of New Mexico and the oil and gas industry's relationship moving forward?
My vision for the future of New Mexico is one in which we develop an economy that is not dependent on oil and gas. I would like to see New Mexico move away from this industry. I see it as a multi-generational plan. I know that there's folks that want us to end our relationship with oil and gas tomorrow. But when we're talking about the families that are impacted, the communities that are impacted from an economic perspective, that isn't necessarily, it's not a good plan, because then there's no alternative for that. And so I think that it is a responsibility of policymakers in Santa Fe to be able to develop that plan. I hope that the contributions I've been able to make over the course of the last 7 years will continue to help to develop that plan. But in my future, the future of this economy in New Mexico does not have oil and gas as the majority of our revenues coming in from that industry. I think that we should completely diversify away from it and no longer depend on oil and gas at all.
I see. So, and I think it's fair to say that you are in support of investing in other alternative energy resources, would you say so?
Absolutely.
So, do you feel that, what kind of alternative energy do you think is best to go after, whether it's solar, wind, nuclear? How do you feel about those in your mind?
I mean, I think that's the conversation that we're all having right now in this moment. There are conversations around advanced technologies that I think give me pause because of the historical, some of the experiences that our state has experienced when it comes to issues to energy sources like nuclear, for example. The state has already begun to work on issues or energy types like hydrogen, and so those energy sources really give me pause. However, I also recognize that there are communities around our state who are desperate for an alternative, and our level of consumption is not going to be reduced significantly. And so I think that until we are able to talk about honestly about our willingness to reduce consumption, consuming as much energy as we do, I don't think that we can't not talk about alternatives. And so those are the conversations that are happening right now. I know that through the coalition work I've been doing with climate justice organizers as well as colleagues, we are having to come to a happy medium, and I just don't know what that happy medium is. And so those are the conversations that we'll be having over the course of the next few months as we head into the session in January.
So Representative Rubio, I have one more question, which is, in my reporting, I've run into environmentalists and things like that in the Permian Basin who feel that not enough is being done in terms of curbing the environmental impacts that the oil and gas industry is having in the area. So what is your response to those individuals?
I think that the response is, and this has been a criticism that I've always had about the environmental community, is that a lot of the work that's being done is very transactional when it comes to going into communities to essentially give their agenda versus actually learning about the community and understanding what the needs of the community are. I think that's what I appreciate about some folks within our state who are doing work around coalition work around climate justice, because they're not just centering environmental impacts, they're also centering public health impacts, they're centering economic impacts. And when you're looking at this issue from a multi intersectional issue-based way rather than just the environment, I think we get a much more robust plan. And when it comes to why we're moving so slow, I mean, that's why we're moving so slow, is because we're trying to include as many people in this conversation as possible. And we're not going to be able to solve this issue overnight. I mean, I'm one of 70 House members who have to be convinced of my vision in the same way that I have to convince 32 other members in the Senate. And so we don't change the world through policy, we change it by organizing. And that's what I think the environmental community needs to focus on, is organizing communities.
Angelica Rubio is the state's representative for New Mexico's 35th Congressional District. Representative, thanks so much for being here today.
Thank you, Johnny.
To learn more about earthquakes in the Permian Basin, be sure to go to krwg.org/shaky-ground. Here, you can explore KRWG's collaboration with the Carlsbad Current Argus and read in-depth coverage of seismic issues at the Texas-New Mexico border. That's krwg.org/shaky-ground. And now moving on, joining me to continue the conversation about New Mexico's oil and gas industry is District 54 State Representative Jim Townsend. Representative Townsend, thanks for being here.
You bet, Johnny. We're glad to be here.
Absolutely. So to begin, what do you feel is the oil and gas industry's biggest challenges that it faces today?
Well, I think the challenges to the oil and gas industry are no different than any other industry. You're always you're looking for operational certainty. You're looking for permitting. You're looking for labor force. You're looking for market. You're always looking for those things that make your business model continue just like it was as you envisioned it, and grow and get better.
You know, in light of environmental concerns such as earthquakes and emissions, how do you as a lawmaker strike a balance between promoting oil and gas production and ensuring that it's a sustainable practice?
Oh, sure. Well, I think you have to realize that oil and gas is a sustainable practice. It's been around for 100 years in New Mexico or thereabouts. And it has gone through many evolutions. I mean, you can think of the way fracturing originally occurred. You can think of the drilling, directional drilling, the use of fresh water. Now we're into, almost totally using reuse water that we're cleaning up and using again and again. So I think all of those things are just part of the evolution of any industry. Earthquakes, as you mentioned, are something that has been tied to disposal, and it has been more significant in areas where disposal was shallow, and most of New Mexico's is much deeper. But I think as producers and injectors become better at monitoring pressures and flow rates, you'll see all of that become steady state and will continue. Getting more permits for more disposals would be helpful. Take some pressure off some of these wells that are not on vacuum, and many of these that are on vacuum, I mean, they quite frankly pose no seismic threat to anything. But if you're creating pressures, there are, things move, and that's fact.
And so I know you touched on this a little bit, but what sort of steps do you think need to be taken to address the connection between these produced water injections and these earthquakes? Is enough being done in your eyes?
Yeah, I think, like I said, I think it's continuing to evolve. I mean, you're seeing more oversight. You're seeing producers getting, operators becoming smarter about the way they're operating facilities. But I have a lot of confidence in the industry and what it does for New Mexico, and I'm sure that they will address this issue and any other issue that comes before it.
And Representative, I think this is something that our viewers would want to know, and that's how do you work with stakeholders from regulatory entities to oil companies to help strike that balance within the industry to make sure that everything is operating smoothly with also taking into account environmental concerns and things like that?
Johnny, what you bring up is very important, and I think every good operator has to work in the communities that they're working in. They have to listen to stakeholders. They have to listen to those grassroots outfits that have special interests. But all of that makes you wiser and makes you a better operator. And so I think it is very important for the industry to do that. And I think they have shown that they're very good at it.
How do you envision the long-term relationship of the industry with New Mexico when you consider factors such as market trends, again, environmental considerations, and even potentially alternative energy sources moving in to sort of take pieces of the energy market?
Yeah, that's a great question, Johnny. And my wife and I had dinner with one of the major leading developers in the oil and gas industry not too awful long ago. And one of the things that we were told that I think is very important is today we are only recovering about 10 to 15% of the oil that's in the rock today. And just think of how big a boom we've had. We had $3.5 billion this year. They've just reported we had about $3 billion last year. That does not include the over $1 billion, almost it's up to $5 billion now that's in the Early Childhood Development Fund. Does not include the severance tax fund that's, $21 billion. What I think is really important is that the state and the industries need to continue to work together, because it is a huge opportunity for New Mexico to continue being a leader in the nation in energy production and to be energy independent. I don't think there's anything that we could do in New Mexico that would make us, or in the nation, that was more important than to become energy independent. Just think of what it does for New Mexico State University. It's huge. And we want to do that all across the state. UNM certainly benefits greatly because of it. And there are tons of jobs across New Mexico, and it's good for the state, and it has to be good for industries as well.
And Representative, the oil and gas industry, like you said, is one of the biggest moneymakers for the state. Do you feel there's any obligation for the state to be investing more in alternative resources, whether it's solar, wind, or even nuclear power?
I think being diversified and always looking at our alternatives is very important. And I think anybody in the energy industry, whether they're in oil and gas or whether they're in the nuclear business or whether they're in what we consider green energy, whether it's wind or solar today, I think we all need to continue to develop, make sure that our industries are sufficient and that they can survive without subsidies of any kind. We need to make sure that these businesses grow and we can deliver a commodity to the market that is economically advantaged so that our business grows, our constituents are employed, and that these businesses are not unique only to New Mexico. We need to thrive outside of New Mexico. And in order to do that, we have to be competitive.
I see. And Representative, in my reporting, the prospect of other states dealing with seismicity is definitely something that popped up, such as Oklahoma with injection-induced seismicity. But with the help of their regulatory agency in Oklahoma, they were able to bring down the number of earthquakes considerably. So is that something that you have looked into? And do you feel that New Mexico could learn from that data from Oklahoma and other states?
Absolutely. We ought to look across the line and learn from anybody and everybody we can how to better our operation. And what Oklahoma has done, my understanding, is what I mentioned early on. They became much better at monitoring their pressures and flow rates, and by doing that, they neutralize that seismic activity. So absolutely, we all have to do that, and I think every operator that I know wants to do that.
So another thing, in my reporting, I've talked to residents in the Permian, residents in Carlsbad, things like that, that feel that not enough is being done to curb the impact that the industry is having on their region and their hometowns. What is your response to those citizens? What would your appeal to them be as a representative?
Well, I think we need to listen to them. We need to make sure that we try to address those concerns. I also am aware of dozens of people that I could put you in contact with that think the industry is operating at the other end of the spectrum, where they do a lot for a lot of people and they keep everybody well informed. But with that being said, you have to do both, and you have to realize in any industry that there are going to be people that you're going to have to work harder to learn what their concerns are and see how you can address them, because we're all neighbors and we're all going to stay in New Mexico. These operations are investments, hard dollar investments in New Mexico, and no one wants it to be a bad investment for the people or for the companies that are investing money.
Mr. Jim Townsend is New Mexico State Representative for District 54. Representative Townsend, thanks so much for joining us today.
You bet. Thank you. And thank you for reporting on our vibrant oil and gas industry in New Mexico.
Yes, sir. That's our time for now. Join us this week on KRWG Radio. Every weekday it's morning edition 5 to 9, fresh air at 11, followed by Here and Now noon to 2, and All Things Considered 4 to 7. KRWG News is always online at krwg.org. And we'd like to hear from you. Email us with story ideas and video submissions. The address is feedback@nmsu.edu. For all of us at KRWG News, I'm Jonny Coker. Have a great week, and we'll see you next time on Newsmakers.